In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, life moved at a predictable pace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, colorful flower beds, and houses that seemed almost identical in design. It was the kind of place where people waved as they passed each other on morning walks. Kids played basketball in driveways, and weekends were spent hosting backyard barbecues. For Ethan Carter, this neighborhood felt like the perfect place to raise his family. A hard-working IT specialist in his mid-30s, Ethan lived there with his wife, Sarah, and their two children, Emma and Liam. Life was simple, and Ethan appreciated the peace and stability it offered. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, small tensions simmered, often bubbling up over trivial matters. One such issue was the strict set of rules enforced by the Homeowners Association, HOA. From lawn maintenance schedules to holiday decorations, the HOA had guidelines for nearly everything. While most residents followed these rules without complaint, there were always a few who took them more seriously than others. And among those rule enforcers, one name stood out: Patricia Hensley. Patricia was known throughout the neighborhood for her no-nonsense attitude and unwavering dedication to the HOA's regulations. She patrolled the streets daily, clipboard in hand, ready to note any infractions she spotted. Whether it was a mailbox painted the wrong shade of blue or a car parked too close to a fire hydrant, nothing escaped her watchful eye. Some neighbors found her diligence admirable, but many others thought she went too far. Her confrontational style often left people feeling frustrated or embarrassed, earning her the nickname Karen behind her back. Ethan had mostly managed to stay out of Patricia's crosshairs until recently. A few weeks ago, he had purchased a second vehicle, a rugged Jeep Wrangler. It wasn't just any car. It was a symbol of freedom and adventure, something he'd dreamed of owning since he was a teenager. He envisioned taking weekend trips with his family, exploring hiking trails, and maybe even going off-roading someday. But for now, the Jeep sat parked outside his house because his garage could only fit one vehicle. On a Thursday evening, after running errands, Ethan pulled the Jeep into his usual spot along the curb. He didn't think much of it. He planned to move it the next day. What he didn't realize was that parking on the street violated one of the HOA's lesser-known rules. To make matters worse, the Jeep happened to be parked near the entrance of the cul-de-sac, making it highly visible to anyone passing by. By the time Ethan walked inside, closed the door, and settled onto the couch, he had no idea how much trouble that seemingly innocent decision would cause. As night fell over Willow Creek, the neighborhood grew quiet. Streetlights cast soft glows on empty sidewalks, and the hum of crickets filled the air. Everything appeared calm and normal. Yet, unbeknownst to Ethan, wheels were already turning elsewhere. Somewhere nearby, a pair of eyes narrowed as they spotted the Jeep sitting innocently by the curb. Those eyes belonged to none other than Patricia Hensley, and she was not about to let this perceived violation slide. Little did anyone know, her actions would soon spiral into an absurd and unforgettable chain of events. The next morning, the sun rose over Willow Creek, casting golden rays across the quiet streets. Ethan woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and stepped outside to enjoy the crisp morning air. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed someone approaching down the sidewalk. It was Patricia Hensley, clipboard in hand, her lips pressed into a thin line. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement, and Ethan immediately felt a sense of dread wash over him. He had seen that look on her face before, determined, unyielding, and ready to pounce. "Good morning, Patricia," Ethan said politely, forcing a smile. He tried to sound cheerful, hoping to diffuse whatever issue she might have brought with her. But Patricia didn't return the greeting. Instead, she stopped directly in front of him, her sharp eyes scanning the Jeep parked by the curb. "You know why I'm here," she said flatly, her tone leaving no room for small talk. Without waiting for a response, she flipped open her clipboard and began reading aloud from what appeared to be a printed copy of the HOA guidelines. Section 3, subsection B. No vehicles are permitted to remain parked on public streets within the Willow Creek subdivision for more than 12 consecutive hours. Ethan blinked, taken aback. He glanced at the Jeep, then back at Patricia. "It's been less than 12 hours, he replied calmly. "I just parked it here last night after running some errands. I'll move it later today." Patricia wasn't satisfied. She tapped her pen against the clipboard, her expression growing even sterner. "That's not the point," she snapped. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a parking lot. We have rules for a reason, to maintain order and keep property values high. If everyone started leaving their cars on the street, it would be chaos." Ethan sighed inwardly. He had heard this speech before, though never directed at him. He understood the importance of keeping the neighborhood tidy, but Patricia's rigid interpretation of the rules often felt excessive. Still, he chose his words carefully, not wanting to escalate the situation. "I get it, Patricia. I really do. But I've got a tight schedule today, and moving the Jeep won't be a problem later. Can we call it a one-time thing?" Patricia's jaw tightened. She clearly wasn't buying it. "Rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she said firmly. "No exceptions. You're setting a bad example for the rest of the community. What if others see your Jeep and decide they can park on the street too? Where does it end?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Ethan resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He knew Patricia wasn't just upset about the Jeep, it was about control. She thrived on enforcing rules, and any deviation from them felt like a personal affront to her authority. Still, he nodded diplomatically. "You're right. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." But Patricia wasn't done yet. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "If the Jeep isn't moved by noon, I'll have no choice but to report you to the HOA board. And trust me, they take these violations very seriously." With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement once more. Ethan watched her go, shaking his head in disbelief. He knew she meant every word. Patricia wasn't the type to bluff or back down. As he finished his coffee, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation. The Jeep wasn't causing any harm. It wasn't blocking traffic, damaging the curb, or creating noise. Why couldn't Patricia focus on bigger issues instead of nitpicking something so minor? By mid-morning, Ethan had almost forgotten about the encounter. He left for work, assuming he'd deal with the Jeep when he returned home. Meanwhile, Patricia stewed over the situation. To her, Ethan's casual attitude toward the rule was unacceptable. In her mind, ignoring the guidelines, even once, was a slippery slope that could unravel the entire fabric of the neighborhood. By lunchtime, she had hatched a plan, convinced that drastic measures were necessary to send a message. Unbeknownst to Ethan, the stage was set for an absurd and explosive confrontation, one that neither of them could have anticipated. As the clock ticked past noon, Ethan's Jeep remained parked in the same spot by the curb. Patricia Hensley paced back and forth inside her house, glancing out the window every few minutes. Her frustration had reached a boiling point. She couldn't believe Ethan hadn't moved the vehicle yet. To her, this wasn't just about a parking rule. It was about respect. Respect for the neighborhood, respect for the HOA guidelines, and most importantly, respect for her asterisk. Patricia's husband, Bob, sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone while sipping a cup of coffee. He glanced up as she muttered under her breath, clearly agitated. "What's eating you now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It's that Jeep," Patricia snapped, pointing toward the window. "Ethan thinks he can just ignore the rules because no one calls him out. Well, I'm not letting him get away with it." Bob sighed, setting his phone down. He'd heard this rant before. Patricia had a way of turning small annoyances into full-blown crusades. Normally, he tried to stay out of her battles, but today she seemed particularly fired up. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked cautiously. Patricia stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We're going to teach him a lesson," she declared. "If he won't follow the rules, then we'll make sure there's no choice." Bob raised an eyebrow. "What exactly does that mean?" Patricia didn't hesitate. She marched over to the garage, rummaged around for a moment, and returned holding a pair of bolt cutters. "We're moving the Jeep ourselves," she announced matter-of-factly. Bob stared at her, stunned. "You're kidding, right? That's not our car. You can't just take someone else's property." "Not taking it," Patricia shot back. "Just relocating it. Once he sees how serious we are, maybe he'll start following the rules." She grabbed her car keys from the counter and headed for the door, expecting Bob to follow. Reluctantly, Bob trailed behind her, still unsure if she was serious. As they approached the Jeep, Patricia scanned the area to ensure no one was watching. The street was eerily quiet. No kids playing, no neighbors chatting on their porches. It felt like the perfect opportunity. She knelt beside the driver's side door and examined the steering wheel lock Ethan had installed. It was sturdy, but not impossible to remove. "This is insane," Bob whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "What if someone sees us?" "No one's going to see us," Patricia replied sharply. "Now hand me the bolt cutters." Bob hesitated, his conscience screaming at him to stop this madness. But Patricia's glare silenced any protest he might have made. Reluctantly, he handed over the tool. With a deep breath, Patricia positioned the bolt cutters around the lock and began squeezing. The metal groaned under the pressure, and after a few tense moments, the lock snapped free. "There," Patricia said triumphantly, tossing the broken lock onto the passenger seat. She climbed into the driver's seat and grinned at Bob. "See, easy." But as she turned the key in the ignition, keys she had conveniently found dangling from the visor, she froze. Something didn't feel right. The Jeep's dashboard lit up, but instead of hearing the engine roar to life, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Several unmarked cars were pulling up silently along the street surrounding them. Officers emerged from the vehicles, their badges glinting in the sunlight. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," one officer commanded, his voice firm but calm. Patricia's heart sank. She looked at Bob, who stood frozen on the sidewalk, his face pale with shock. Neither of them realized the Jeep had been parked near a police task force conducting surveillance operations. What started as a misguided attempt to enforce HOA rules had spiraled into something far more serious and humiliating. For a brief moment, Patricia considered arguing her case, explaining that she was only trying to uphold the neighborhood's standards. But the stern expressions on the officers' faces told her it wouldn't matter. All eyes were on her now, and there was no escaping the absurdity of what she had just done. The sight of multiple police officers surrounding the Jeep sent a wave of panic through Patricia. Her hands froze on the steering wheel, and for a moment, she couldn't move or speak. The reality of what she had done hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just dealing with an angry neighbor anymore. This was something much bigger and far more serious. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," the officer repeated, his tone firm but controlled. Patricia hesitated, her mind racing to come up with some explanation that might make sense of this absurd situation. But as she looked around at the sea of stern faces and flashing badges, she realized there was no way out. Slowly, reluctantly, she opened the door and stepped out of the Jeep, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Bob stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching the bolt cutters he still held in his hand. His face turned pale as one of the officers approached him. "Sir, can I see those?" the officer asked, gesturing toward the tool. Bob nodded mutely and handed them over, avoiding eye contact. It was clear to everyone present that this couple wasn't your typical criminals. They were suburban homeowners dressed in casual clothes, looking utterly bewildered by the chaos they had created. Meanwhile, the lead officer walked over to Patricia, who was now standing awkwardly beside the Jeep. "Can you explain what's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. Patricia swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. I was just enforcing the HOA rules," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This Jeep was parked illegally, and I thought..." You thought you could break into someone else's property and drive it away. The officer interrupted, raising an eyebrow. His expression softened slightly, but it was clear he found the situation both baffling and concerning. Before Patricia could respond, another officer spoke up. "We're conducting surveillance operations nearby," he explained. "When we saw someone tampering with this vehicle, we had to intervene immediately. This isn't just about parking violations. It's about unauthorized entry and potential interference with law enforcement." Patricia's eyes widened in horror. She hadn't even considered the possibility that her actions might disrupt something so significant. All she'd been thinking about was teaching Ethan a lesson that had spiraled completely out of control. While the officers questioned Patricia and Bob, dispatch ran a check on the Jeep's license plate. They quickly identified Ethan Carter as the registered owner and called him at work. When Ethan answered the phone, he was confused at first. "My Jeep? What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. The officer on the line explained the situation. Someone had attempted to steal his vehicle, but it turned out to be part of a larger incident involving law enforcement. Ethan listened in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. He thanked the officer, grabbed his keys, and rushed home, leaving his unfinished tasks behind. When Ethan arrived back in Willow Creek, the scene outside his house looked like something out of a movie. Police cars lined the street, and a small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered to watch the spectacle. As he pulled up, one of the officers waved him over. "Mr. Carter, I assume this is your vehicle?" the officer asked, pointing to the Jeep. Ethan nodded, still trying to wrap his head around everything. "Yes, it's mine. What exactly happened?" The officer gave him a quick rundown of the events, explaining how Patricia and Bob had been detained after attempting to take the Jeep. By this point, Patricia and Bob were sitting on the curb, looking thoroughly defeated. Ethan stared at them, torn between anger and amusement. He couldn't believe what they had done, all because of a simple parking rule. "I'm sorry this happened," the officer said. "Do you want to press charges?" Ethan hesitated. On one hand, he was furious about the damage to his steering wheel lock and the invasion of his property. On the other hand, seeing Patricia and Bob humiliated and surrounded by police felt like punishment enough. After a long pause, he shook his head. "No, I don't think that's necessary," he said finally. "But maybe you should remind them that breaking into someone's car isn't the best way to handle neighborhood disputes." The officer nodded, clearly amused by the whole ordeal. As Ethan inspected the Jeep and assessed the damage, the crowd of neighbors began to disperse, whispering among themselves. News of Patricia's failed scheme would spread quickly, becoming the talk of the town, and cementing her reputation as HOA Karen forever. The legal aftermath of Patricia's ill-conceived attempt to relocate Ethan's Jeep was both swift and humiliating. While Ethan had chosen not to press charges against her personally, the police were obligated to investigate further due to the circumstances surrounding the incident. What started as a simple parking dispute quickly escalated into something far more serious when officers revealed that Patricia's actions had inadvertently interfered with an ongoing surveillance operation. It turned out that the quiet cul-de-sac where Ethan's Jeep was parked wasn't just another suburban street. It happened to be near a house under observation by a local police task force. The officers had been monitoring suspected illegal activity in the area for weeks, keeping a low profile to avoid tipping off their targets. When Patricia approached the Jeep with bolt cutters and climbed inside, she unknowingly drew attention to herself and disrupted the delicate balance of the operation. Though no critical harm came to the investigation, her behavior raised red flags and required immediate intervention. Patricia and Bob were taken to the station for questioning, where they spent several uncomfortable hours explaining their bizarre plan to law enforcement officials. At first, Patricia tried to justify her actions, insisting she was merely enforcing HOA rules and hadn't intended any real harm. But as the officers pressed her for details, it became clear how misguided and reckless her decision had been. Cutting a lock, entering someone else's property without permission, and attempting to drive away with it were all serious offenses, regardless of intent. By the end of the interrogation, Patricia looked defeated, her usual bravado replaced by shame. Ultimately, Patricia faced multiple charges: attempted theft, unauthorized entry, and interference with a law enforcement operation. Her lawyer argued that the situation stemmed from a misunderstanding and emphasized her lack of criminal history, but the judge remained unmoved. In court, Patricia was ordered to pay restitution for the damaged steering wheel lock, complete community service hours, and attend anger management classes. Additionally, she received a stern warning that future infractions would result in harsher penalties. News of Patricia's legal troubles spread like wildfire through Willow Creek, cementing her reputation as HOA Karen. Neighbors who had once tolerated, or even supported, her strict adherence to the rules now found themselves cringing at her name. Social media groups buzzed with screenshots of court documents and memes mocking her overzealous behavior. Even local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing it the case of the overzealous HOA enforcer. For a brief period, Willow Creek gained national attention, much to the chagrin of its residents. But beyond the headlines and jokes lay deeper consequences. Many neighbors began to question whether the HOA's rigid enforcement of minor rules was worth the trouble it caused. Some argued that such strictness only bred resentment and division, while others pointed out that common sense should always outweigh bureaucracy. A few outspoken residents called for sweeping reforms within the organization, urging leaders to prioritize community spirit over nitpicky regulations. For Ethan, the entire ordeal reinforced his belief in choosing kindness over conflict. He could have pursued harsher penalties against Patricia, relishing the chance to see her publicly humiliated. Instead, he opted for compassion, recognizing that dragging her through a lengthy legal battle wouldn't benefit anyone. Still, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served in its own quirky way. As he watched Patricia retreat from public view, he hoped the experience might teach her a valuable lesson about boundaries, empathy, and the importance of minding one's own business. In the end, the incident left an indelible mark on Willow Creek, not just because of the absurdity of what had happened, but because it forced everyone to reflect on the kind of community they wanted to build. And though Patricia's fall from grace was dramatic, it paved the way for a brighter chapter in the neighborhood story, one defined by cooperation, understanding, and a renewed commitment to looking out for one another. The fallout from Patricia's ill-fated attempt to relocate Ethan's Jeep rippled through Willow Creek like a storm. By the time the police cars had pulled away and the crowd of neighbors dispersed, whispers about the incident were already spreading faster than wildfire. Social media lit up with posts, memes, and even a few jokes at Patricia's expense. The phrase HOA Karen cuts lock to steal Jeep became an instant catchphrase in local group chats, ensuring that her actions would not soon be forgotten. At the next HOA meeting, tensions reached a boiling point. The community center was packed with residents, many of whom had never attended a meeting before, but were now eager to voice their opinions. Chairs scraped against the floor as people shuffled into place, and the air buzzed with murmurs of anticipation. Patricia and Bob sat quietly near the back of the room, avoiding eye contact with anyone. They looked smaller somehow, their usual confidence replaced by shame and discomfort. When it came time for open discussion, hands shot up all over the room. One neighbor recounted how Patricia once reported them for having a bird bath that was too colorful. Another shared a story about receiving a formal letter because their mailbox leaned slightly to one side after a snowstorm. Each anecdote drew laughter or groans from the audience, highlighting just how much frustration had been simmering beneath the surface. Then Ethan stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He simply walked to the front of the room, where everyone could see him clearly. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of his presence settle over the crowd. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," he began, "but I think we need to talk about what kind of neighborhood we want to live in." He went on to describe how ridiculous and ultimately harmful Patricia's actions had been. He explained that while rules were important, they shouldn't come at the cost of kindness and understanding. "We're all human," he said. "We make mistakes. Sometimes we park our cars in the wrong spot or forget to mow the lawn on schedule. But instead of punishing each other, why don't we try helping each other? Why don't we focus on building a community where people feel supported, not policed?" His words struck a chord with many in the room. Applause broke out, followed by nods of agreement. Even some of Patricia's staunchest defenders seemed swayed by Ethan's message. As the meeting continued, several residents proposed changes to the HOA's approach, suggesting more flexible enforcement and opportunities for dialogue rather than punishment. For Patricia, however, the damage was done. Over the following weeks, she and Bob became increasingly isolated. Neighbors who had once tolerated, or even admired, her dedication to the rules now avoided her. Her name was rarely mentioned without a chuckle or a roll of the eyes. Eventually, she resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. In her absence, the neighborhood began to shift. New leaders emerged, focused on fostering connection rather than control. Yard signs encouraging kindness popped up across Willow Creek, and impromptu gatherings brought neighbors together in ways they hadn't experienced before. Slowly but surely, the community transformed into something warmer, friendlier, and more inclusive. Ethan played a key role in this change. Inspired by the incident, he started organizing events designed to strengthen bonds among residents. There were potluck dinners, movie nights under the stars, and even a weekend cleanup initiative that turned into a block party. People laughed, shared stories, and discovered common ground they hadn't realized existed. Through it all, the Jeep remained parked proudly in Ethan's driveway, a symbol not just of adventure, but of resilience and unity. Every time someone passed by, they couldn't help but smile, remembering the day when a simple parking violation sparked a revolution of sorts. Life in Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but thanks to Ethan's efforts, it was better. And as for Patricia, she faded into the background, her reign as HOA Karen ending as abruptly as it had begun. In the months that followed, life in Willow Creek settled into a new rhythm. The neighborhood felt different, not just because of the absence of Patricia's clipboard-wielding patrols, but because of the subtle yet profound shift in its spirit. Where there had once been tension and division, there was now camaraderie and connection. Neighbors who had barely known each other's names were suddenly exchanging warm greetings on morning walks or lending helping hands during home repairs. It was as if the absurdity of Patricia's actions had served as a wake-up call, reminding everyone what truly mattered: kindness, understanding, and community. Patricia and Bob largely withdrew from neighborhood activities, retreating into their house like shadows. Their lawn remained perfectly manicured, their mailbox painted the approved shade of blue, but they no longer attended HOA meetings or hosted block parties. Some speculated that they were embarrassed by the fallout. Others believed they simply couldn't face the judgment of their peers. Either way, their influence waned, leaving space for new voices to emerge, voices that prioritized cooperation over control. Ethan, meanwhile, became something of a local hero. His calm handling of the Jeep incident earned him respect and admiration from neighbors who had previously seen him as just another face in the crowd. People admired not only his restraint in choosing not to press charges against Patricia, but also his willingness to turn a negative situation into an opportunity for growth. He didn't seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway, and he embraced it with humility. Inspired by the changes taking place, Ethan continued organizing events to bring the community closer together. One particularly memorable evening saw dozens of residents gathered in the cul-de-sac where the infamous Jeep drama had unfolded. Strings of fairy lights twinkled overhead, music played softly from a portable speaker, and tables groaned under the weight of homemade dishes contributed by neighbors. Kids darted around playing tag while adults laughed and shared stories over plates of food. At one point, someone joked about stealing Ethan's Jeep again, drawing roars of laughter from the crowd. The Jeep itself became a symbol of resilience and unity. Ethan kept it parked proudly in his driveway, its rugged frame serving as a reminder of how far the neighborhood had come. Occasionally, he'd take it out for weekend adventures with his family, sparking waves and smiles from passersby. Once, a neighbor even left a note on his windshield. "Thanks for teaching us all a lesson we'll never forget." As winter approached, the transformation of Willow Creek became undeniable. Holiday decorations went up earlier than usual, with neighbors working together to string lights across trees and hang wreaths on lampposts. For the first time in years, there were no complaints about mismatched colors or improperly placed inflatables. Instead, people marveled at how festive and welcoming the streets looked, thanks to their collective effort. Even the HOA meetings took on a friendlier tone. New members joined the board, bringing fresh ideas and a focus on collaboration rather than enforcement. Rules still existed, of course. They were necessary, but they were applied with flexibility and empathy. Residents began to see the HOA not as an adversary, but as a partner in creating a better community. Looking back, Ethan often reflected on how quickly things could have spiraled in the opposite direction. If he had chosen anger over forgiveness, if he had pressed charges against Patricia, the outcome might have been very different. But by responding with grace and humor, he had helped steer the neighborhood toward healing instead of further division. And so, life in Willow Creek carried on, quieter and sweeter than before. While whispers of HOA Karen occasionally surfaced during casual conversations, they were usually accompanied by laughter and headshakes. The story had become part of the neighborhood's lore, a cautionary tale wrapped in absurdity, but also a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the importance of looking out for one another. For Ethan, the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a symbol of adventure, yes, but also of resilience, unity, and the unexpected ways life can teach valuable lessons. As he sat on his porch one crisp autumn evening, watching leaves swirl in the breeze and listening to the distant sound of children laughing, he felt grateful for the Jeep, for his neighbors, and for the little moments that made Willow Creek feel like home.